Thank you all for joining us today for the Facilitating Inclusive Online Discussions workshop. Joining us today are Suzanne Becker and Ted Wiseman, embedded instructional technologists in online education. Today, you're going to learn how to develop engaging online discussions and establish expectations for virtual discussions. So with that, I'll hand it over to our presenters.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here. I just want to make sure everyone can see our screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect. All right, then I'm gonna turn it over and let Suzanne get started.
Great. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And just learned, this is Ted Wiseman. I'm Suzanne Becker. We're embedded instructional technologists with the Office of Online Education. We work with the larger college, but we also work amongst departments as well. And so today we're here to talk about how do you do engaging discussions in the online space. There's more to the discussion, when we're getting into the online class, there's more to just kind of taking what you do in a face-to-face class and transferring it to online. So hopefully today you will leave with some strategies and some useful kind of hands-on things to implement as we move into the next semester and you start up your classes. So meaningful discussions are really crucial in the online space, and discussions are one of the best ways for students to engage with students, and for students to engage with their instructors. And it's one of the most significant ways that you learn in an online course. And I think we're all, real wary of the answer a prompt and then responded to college, right? And I think also one of the things that almost every instructor struggles with beyond that is just how do you get your students to engage, right? We want to have meaningful engagement in our courses. And so today, we're going to talk about some of the best practices for you to do that, and we're going to learn how to develop engaging online discussions, and also kind of learn how to establish some good expectations and employ best practices specifically for your online discussions.
So with that, we have three areas that we're going to cover: spaces, activities, and resources. And in regards to this, we have the first part is the community of inquiry. I'll let you do this one.
Yeah. So yeah, talking about talking about the different spaces, the types of activities, and the resources that you use. Either way, there are, when you get into an online class, there is, for those that haven't heard of it, what we call a community of inquiry theoretical model. And that's the model that the Office of Online Education uses to guide course development and to help us think about how to show up and how to put a class together, and what are the best ways to create sort of a deep and meaningful learning experience in our course, right? And so as you can see, the community of inquiry is made up of three different presences, each in and of themselves have their own meaning, but they also overlap. And that is where, when all three of these are engaged, you get the most meaningful learning experience in your class. But individually, each are very important as well, and they show up in different ways, and they're all important when we think about discussions. The social presence, right, this includes the ability of your students to kind of put themselves socially into the class, right? This is, when we talk about social presence, the ways that you might think about fostering a learning community in your course, or, using different ways to provide students opportunities for collaborative learning, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. And right, creating these cooperative learning opportunities for them, right? So the social presence is important, as is the cognitive presence. The cognitive presence, I always like to kind of describe as the light bulb moment. It's how do we know our students have learned? Right? It's the extent to which our students are able to kind of construct and confirm meaning from the content that they're learning in class. And so cognitive presence asks us to think about the ways that we might develop critical thinking in our courses. and how we might tailor our content to meet the different learning needs of the students that are in the class, right? And it's also things like the pacing of your course and is there the right amount of content in your course, right? So it's the cognitive presence that sets it up to really help students engage with the content and get that light bulb moment for them. And then the teaching presence, we're going to talk more about that today as well. This is really about how you think about designing your course and about administering the learning activities that you're going to do in your course, right? And the ways that you provide instruction, basically you're going to consider how you put together your course and how you show up in your course, right? So thinking about what kind of presence are you going to have, right? How are you going to, particularly in an online course, make sure that you're connecting with your students, right? How are you going to make students aware of how to be successful in your course? And how are you going to communicate your expectations to them? And most importantly, right, how are you going to provide some feedback for them in a timely way? So we're going to kind of look at how all these things play out when we talk about discussions in the classroom.
Which leads us to this idea of social learning. For those who are unfamiliar, so active learning is something that people have heard of very frequently, especially in teaching circles. And really this is about, how people are presenting and, really think about it in terms of that Bloom's taxonomy, working their way through the process of, remembering, understanding, analyzing, evaluating, those types of things. And then rather than passively absorbing instruction, they're actively engaging. And then there's also the idea of constructivism, which is important because it relies on the learner to select and transform information. And what this means is that you're putting the learner is the center of the course, and that you are trying to appeal to the learner instead of the instructor being the one that is guiding what's going on. It's that you actually the learner. And this is really important in discussions because frequently when we've all been in those discussions that it feels like it's there to meet the needs of the content or the instructor. It's not there to meet the needs of the student. So we want our discussions to ultimately build a space where they can, students have the ability to construct meaning. And then whole class teaching, this is where it focuses attention and provides structured teacher-focused group interaction. This is really important. This is what a discussion truly is. And I think that what we've missed in the past, or what has happened in online discussions, is that we end up with this idea that online discussions are just become rote. They become repetitive. They become, something where students are really just kind of meeting the criteria, but not actually doing any of that active learning. They are not really making any meaning. They're just meeting some basic, checking boxes. So with that, what Suzanne and I have done is we've taken a look at it and we've created what we call spaces and activities. So the spaces, and these are the areas that you can use discussions or how discussions are used, are in Canvas, WebEx, and Panopto. And then the activities, for example, and Suzanne's going to get into this later, some more activities, are an intro video, muddiest point video assignments. But ultimately, what really happens is that you need both of these things. You need the space and you need the activity. You need to be deliberate. And what does that mean when I say spaces and activities? So I'll dive right into spaces. Spaces are deliberate, they're thoughtful, they're relevant, they have high stakes versus low stakes. So in Canvas, and you'll get a link to this, this presentation that has direct videos for you if you're working in these spaces. In Canvas, one of the biggest things to use is Canvas groups. Suzanne, once again, will talk about this also. But Canvas groups is a way of making a class a smaller class. So when you have, 20, 30 students, something like that, you can break them up into smaller groups. It's a really useful tool, and it's one that we definitely support and we definitely promote. Within that, you have the discussions, and we'll talk more about what that looks like, those discussions and how they look. We have an example of what a solid discussion prompt looks like. In WebEx, we have breakout rooms. For those of you who are unfamiliar with breakout rooms, they are essentially a small group. And that is a way of fostering discussions in that synchronous mode when you are meeting. You should be using those. The next is Panopto. Panopto is really important because it allows for students to create, for the instructor to create student-driven spaces for engagement and interaction. If you're not using Panopto to record videos, it is a great resource for you to explore. And within that, there's Panopto quizzes, where within a video you can have checks for understanding, which can lead to discussions. And so ultimately, why do I put these three things up here? It's to identify where and how students are going to be engaging in the content, how they're going to be engaging with each other, and how they're going to be engaging with the instructor. And then that feeds into those discussions that we're talking about. So one of the things that we do have is an example of a Jamboard. And so we were thinking about that we were going to have people kind of go through this and talk about another activity that you can use, a way of fostering discussions, but I just wanted to show it to you. You'll have access to it at another time, but the Jamboard is just a great resource for you to, instead of that traditional discussion that where you go in, you answer a prompt, you have two things, so on and so forth. Ultimately, it leads to this, and I'll turn it over to Suzanne, where this talks about, when we talk about discussions, what works and what doesn't work. And so the first thing is that we've all been in, and I'll start with the what did not work. And so what did not work is like canned discussions, okay? Canned discussions, those ones that we do, no structure, a lack of integration with technology, a lack of purpose or direction. We know what those look like. And so we want to make sure that we move away from those to what works. And that would be.
So, yeah, it's real important to think about. I mean, even for your face-to-face classes or TA anything, right? You know clearly when things do not work. What really works, though, and we'll go into this a little bit more, is that you respond to your discussions timely, in a timely way, right? You want not only the content to be timely in your course and up to date with what you're doing and pertain directly to some of the things that you're working on, but you also want to respond to your students in a timely way. So they know somebody's out there, right? Actually reading through their things. And it's also important because we know sometimes discussions can get a little bit out into left field, and you want to make sure you're kind of there to help guide people back. We want to make sure that your discussions are engaging. And part of the way to do that is you can incorporate things like video or audio, or have students use different forms of text. We're going to look at a couple of examples of what that looks like. You want to make sure that you're using inclusive language when you're setting things up, that you're providing really clear instructions, and that what you're doing is appropriate for the size of the class, right? And we know our class sizes vary. You can have 12 students, or you could have 72 students. But thinking about what tends to work, right, is just sort of having these guidelines and parameters. And again, we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like, right? So one of the things is developing a good discussion, right? How do we do that? What does that mean, right? If we develop a good discussion, some of those strategies that we just looked at will just sort of happen naturally. So what you are seeing here is an overview of how you can set up your discussion in Canvas, right? Which is providing an overview of what you are wanting the students to do, being really specific about the requirements that you want them to do, right? Oftentimes in a face-to-face class, we can kind of have conversations where the gaps get filled in. In the online space, you need to be very deliberate and very specific about what you're actually asking students to do and why you're asking them to do it, right? So as you can see, the requirements are, this is a 3-2-1 example, which we can talk a little bit more what that looks like if you're not familiar with it. But so it's telling the students exactly what is required, and then how they're going to be evaluated, right? That's, students are super concerned about, like, hey, how are you evaluating the work that I do? Very specific about the due dates, and then we always like to include a how to participate link, right? Because sometimes students that may be new to the class, it can be confusing for them. They may not know where to click. So providing an actual how to participate in this discussion just makes it crystal clear. And again, I just want to remind folks that we will be sending out these slides and some resources after this presentation. So you're going to have these concrete examples that you can look at, and please feel free to use in your own class when you're setting up your discussions.
And I'll chime in here. So this is really important when we talk about that space that we're creating and being very deliberate, being very relevant, being very clear and explicit. We could probably open it up to the larger group, and we could have, and I think Suzanne hit the nail on the head when she said, we know when things don't work, right? And frequently when we're in discussions, they are that they fall flat. And how do they do that? And if we go back to that community of inquiry and we talk about those three presences, the teaching presence, the cognitive presence, and the social presence, you can see here that we have very clear cognitive presence, right? So that 3-2-1 has that clear cognitive presence, that social presence. So here, what you're doing is for your, the peer responses and things like that. The teaching presence, here we're very clear about how students are getting points, right? You're going through and you're being very explicit and saying, hey, it's not just 5 or 0, right? Which is usually what it is, or it's some random number, or it's like you get 10 points or no points. Here, it's very clear that, you know what, you're going to get 1 point for every item you learn. You're going to get 2 points for a question. You're going to get 1 point for your big takeaway and 2 points for each of your peer responses. I know for me personally, especially when I was a graduate assistant and when I was teaching, I was not this explicit, nor was I given this explicit directions. So that's a huge part of this. So this is just a sample for you to take a look at, which leads to, so once you have those spaces, so you're in the Canvas shell, you're in a classroom, you are in a synchronous environment, you are in WebEx, you've recorded your videos, you have your content available, you made sure that you have been explicit with your instructions, and you've been very deliberate with what you've done. You've created this space. Now the question is what do you fill the space with? And ultimately, that is where the activities come into play.
Yeah, and so again, the more sort of active learning, the more ways that can facilitate that collaboration, again, to cognitive presence, the more that you can be present, right, for your teaching presence in that space. So we thought we'd take just a look at a couple of examples. The introduction video is one of the most, probably one of the best ways for you to get some interaction and engage with your students in class. It's a great way for your students to meet you, to get to know a little bit about you and get to know a little bit about them. So this is just one example of what a ask for creating an introduction video can look like. This is from a course that I did over affairs, and it's asking not just myself but also the class to create an introduction video. Here you see the purpose, you see the task, you see the criteria for grading, and then resources. What we did was we provided students a video on how to actually make a video, right? And so, again, the more information we can provide for students to make it more crystal clear, the better. Because I like Ted, I can think back to, being in classes and just being sometimes so lost. And also it gets overwhelming when students have to click outside of the assignment. And so this is why we try to link everything in the actual discussion, whether it's links, whether it's embedding a video. So this is sort of one example of what that could look like. Yeah. Another example, again, is creating the welcome video. Again, this is a welcome video that's asking students not just to create videos necessarily, but to use different types of multimedia in their videos, right? So again, this is creating an intro video, asking students to tell us their names and 3 things that they want to share with their peers, right? But these 3 things, right, must be shared in different formats. So this gets students to engage with the content and with each other, and it creates actually awesome engagement and discussion in this assignment, because people are sharing memes and they're sharing audio recordings and they're sharing photos of their dogs and their cats and their families, and they're sharing, favorite, things that they're watching. And so it's a really fun exercise, right? To share things about yourself in these different formats, right? And then again, the requirements, the things that you share must be explained with a minimum of 2 sentences, be appropriate, right, for the context, and then provide folks something new about yourself. So this really helps engage students. And again, laying out very clearly how they're being evaluated, when it's due, and how to participate. And again, with just any kind of helpful resources on the bottom in terms of embedding videos, embedding images in discussions, and even creating video, right? So those are 2 different examples of different ways that you can create very interactive introductory discussions and videos in your course that create points of discussion and engagement and interaction with the students, with content, students between themselves, and students with instructors, right? And part of your teaching presence is hopping into the discussions and also introducing yourself and being like, oh, yeah, that's an awesome picture of your dog. Here's a picture of my dog, right? Or whatever it might be, right? So you've got a chance to communicate. The other thing that we mentioned briefly was thinking about group discussions. And the great thing that Canvas does is it does allow you to create groups for your students. And when you have a larger class, this can be a great way to kind of mitigate the overwhelm that you and students can experience being in a big class setting. So again, provide the overview of what the assignment is. This is a small group project and you've already been put into groups, right, in this case. And in this case, the assignment is to watch a TED Talk and talk about something that's related to it, right, based on what we've been doing in class. And there's some information here about way to search key terms for what you're looking for, talking about key figures in the field, right? Just some guides and prompts to help them think through things. And then what to do after they watch the talk, right? The other thing that Canvas allows you to do is select roles for your students. And I think it can be very handy to have somebody selected as a group leader. And so in this case, there's a group leader and there's 2 things that the group needs to do. 1, the group leader needs to find the TED Talk and post it on the discussion board for others to see. And then the non-group leaders, right, select their favorite quotes out of it, put the timestamps in for that. The group leader replies to each person about what they have posted, and then the non-group leaders, right, reply to respond to the other quotes that have been posted. The directions themselves probably do a better job of explaining it. But as you can see, it's very clear and everybody is being given a different role to interact, and these are being posted on the discussion board so the groups can discuss amongst themselves. Again, grading is laid out pretty clearly. The due dates are posted, information on how to participate, and again, a link to how to embed YouTube videos into the discussion board, right? So we want to contain everything to the discussion post. And these types of examples allow for a lot of engagement in class. Again, students really get to engage with each other in this content. The third sort of active learning strategy, if you will, that I just wanted to talk about, and we're going to provide you actually a whole list. One of the resources is we've got a whole list of different strategies that you can use for active learning points in your course. But one that I really like, because it is pretty low stakes, it's low energy, but you get a high return on it, it's the muddiest point. The muddiest point is something that you can reserve a little bit of time at the end of class, after you've been doing a lesson, a discussion, whatever. And you can just ask folks, right? What is, you know, what is one of the most, what's something that you're still struggling with from the discussion, right? Essentially, what is the muddiest point? You can ask them to write, literally, you can say or post, what is the muddiest point in whatever your lecture topic was? And that provides an opportunity for discussion and response, either for the end of a class, if you're doing a synchronous class, right? Like something on WebEx, or you can save it for beginning of your next class. And if you do this in a non-synchronous class, in an asynchronous class, and you can treat it as a Canvas assignment, it's a very low stakes assignment, or you could even do it as extra credit. But what it does is it gets students to engage with the content, and it gives you as the instructor an idea of where students are having issues, if there are any points that you need to explain, right? You may get, you know, maybe feedback that is not useful, but I find almost always that there are gems that come through, because generally if one student has a question, so do others. And it's very effective for really not just clarifying topic, but helping students think through and you know, actively engage in the learning process, right? The whole point of active learning is to create engagement, but also have students actively participate in the learning process, as opposed to being like passive recipients receiving knowledge. So at this point, does anyone have any questions about what we're talking about any of the strategies that we've used, about the community of inquiry? Okay, I'll check the chat and see real quick. Yeah, so just kind of to reiterate, right? The things that you want to provide for your students in these various spaces, whether you're in Canvas, you know, whether you're in WebEx, whether you're using Panopto, you want to do things that are learner-centered. You want to encourage your students to learn from each other. You want to, you know, if you can, have them take as much responsibility for learning, and have them, you know, just different ways to engage in information. If it works for folks, I think we can go back to the Jamboard activity if we want to take a moment and just see how the Jamboard works and kind of participate in that. We can talk about if you've got any experience, or if you just want to share any strategies that have worked, or any, you know, sometimes you really have something that you are like, oh, that was an epic failure, and you learn from that and you figure out how to do it differently. So we want to do this on the Jamboard, or folks just want to share their experiences. This is a great time to do that. So can everyone see the Jamboard? Okay, got some thumbs up. Can you guys access the Jamboard? Are you able to write on the Jamboard?
No, I don't think we're able to write on it,
Okay,
but we can see it. And there's a couple things going on in the chat, I believe.
yes. Okay, Carly, do you have any reflections for how to engage students in an asynchronous course? Yes, lots of reflections and thoughts about that. Great response, ask students to meet at least once a week, virtual office hours. Yeah, so virtual office hours, this is something we didn't mention, but thank you, Sarah, for mentioning those, because virtual office hours are a great way to engage with your students. And we've learned this. We learned so much over our pandemic year. We knew that, particularly in the online space, places for students to engage with um, their instructors was super important. Virtual office hours was great. And I recommend, if you have time to be available at different points in the day, because there are some students, particularly in the online space, they may be working during the day. It may be difficult for them to log in at like 1 p.m. There are other students that work at night. So if you can provide sort of 2 different times to do office hours, that is a great thing. The other way to engage with students is also giving them feedback. There are all sorts of different ways you can provide your students feedback. In the SpeedGrader, there are options for you to type out, right, responses to them. There are also options for you to reply with an audio, and there's also ways to create videos. Students really, really appreciate the audio responses that they often get. Yeah, and answering the discussion. So one thing I would also say in terms of discussions, right? So we want to create as engaging discussions as possible. If it's hard when we have many classes, and sometimes we have really big classes online. I know when I have taught classes, sometimes I have, we'll be teaching 2 sections of class, and if it's like an intro class, right, like a social 101 class, there can be 50 students in each of those classes. And that's a lot of replying to people, and that's a lot of, it can be overwhelming for grading, right? It can be overwhelming for interacting, but one of the things I find is checking into the class 2 or 3 times a week, responding to discussions as they come on board, or putting people into groups are very effective ways for engaging with students. And don't be afraid to really, have your instructor presence in the class, right? Don't be afraid to hop in and say like, hey, James, that is a great response. I really like what you've said here, and post something to say, hey, you guys, did you all see what James posted? This is a really great idea. What do y'all think about this, right? So there are ways to create that engagement with your instructors, or I'm sorry, with your students. One of the resources we're going to provide for you is a whole list of active learning activities. These can be things like think, pair, share, 3, 2, 1, the muddiest point. It can be doing a Jamboard. It can be using a word cloud. It can be having students do reflection papers. It can be having them do 1-minute writing prompts and then talking about it. There are all sorts of ways to do that. Yes, and posting a summation of discussion follow-up. Your announcement tool is actually a great tool also for you to connect with students. Oftentimes, that's a great way to give feedback, whether you're doing a discussion or a quiz, or there are main points you want to pull out. You can create an announcement that goes out to the class that summarizes either the feedback that you'd like to give or important talking points that folks may have brought up in discussions. Yeah, especially if you have a lot of students. Thank you, Steph. The Jamboard for synchronous classes is a good way to get folks to participate as well. In asynchronous classes, Ted mentioned Panopto earlier. Panopto is great for either recording videos or if you're doing a class lecture, there are points in Panopto that you can insert knowledge checks, and it can be something as simple as just a summation of a point that happened, or you can ask students, 1 or 2 or 3 very low stakes questions just so it keeps them on the same page. You can also create discussion points within that. Other questions, other thoughts. There are just so many different ways in your class that you can drive discussion, connect with your students, right? Students connect in different ways, especially in discussions. There's student-to-student connection, student-to-content connection, and student-to-instructor connection. And so when you are setting up your discussions, these are things that you can keep in mind. Are you wanting students to engage with content? Are you wanting them to engage with each other? Are you wanting them to engage with both, right? So there are just a variety of things that you can do to really drive engagement in your course and have students interact with each other, interact with you. And, one of the things we really strive to do, and anybody that has taught online or been in online classes, that even as an instructor, but certainly as a student, sometimes you can feel kind of isolated and sometimes you can feel distant. One of the things we want to do is really mitigate that feeling of isolation and create as much of a learning community as we can in class. And so the more we can have students engage with each other and with instructors, the better we become at fostering that learning community, right? And facilitating some of these active learning strategies is very, very useful to that. Do we have other questions? Recommend using videos to provide responses to discussion posts, for example. You absolutely can do that. Yeah, you can. I do know folks that do create videos to summarize or just respond directly to discussion posts. Certainly, if you're asking students to create introductory videos, I recommend creating your own introductory video. And as much as you can put yourself in the course, and responding by audio and video is one way to do that, it just really helps humanize you and your course to students, right? Because students want to know that they're not just pressing a button and turning things in, right? They want to know that there's somebody on the other end that is actually reading to and responding to and thinking about the work that hopefully they are thoughtfully turning in and creating, right? And so creating a video response is a great way to do that. Creating a general video. There are folks that create videos when they open each new module, right? Part of their introductory to the module is an introductory video that they have of themselves talking about what the module is going to be about and what students are going to be engaging with and what the expectations are. You can do the same thing for discussions. So yes, if that answers your question, we recommend as a best practice, creating opportunities to engage with your students as much as possible. Absolutely creating an introductory video is a best practice. And then in the course of your class, when you can have those moments, absolutely take them if you're able and comfortable doing so. Other questions? Have a little bit of time left. Let's see. Let's see if I can. Right, so just to wrap us up a bit, and please feel free to, if you've got questions, drop them in the chat. Please unmute yourself and feel free to ask. But essentially, when we facilitate online discussions, right, the spaces that we're doing, so the activities that we are providing for students and the resources that we are using are really key, right? And so just thinking about how you're going to use a space, there are ways, again, to facilitate face-to-face that you can kind of bring over into an online environment, but you're always going to have to modify it a bit to meet the needs of the space, right? We don't have the ability to oftentimes have those direct conversations with our students. So being purposeful, being clear, and being really thoughtful about what you're asking students to do can go a long way to helping create those moments of engagement. Right? Establishing expectations is key. I don't think we can stress this enough. Even going as far, if you have the time or the opportunity sometimes, to provide an example of what you want your students to do, right? To model. So if you have a specific way that you would like them to engage in a discussion, to respond in a discussion, providing them sort of a model of what that might look like goes a long way. So for example, we I think all want to avoid what can become a very rote exercise, and both students and instructors can come to dread, like, oh no, it's another weekly discussion, and students kind of rush through and do a response, and then they respond in a very canned way, right? Which canned strategy we know does not work. They can respond in a very canned way to their colleagues, their peers. Something that can be very effective is, just modeling for your students how you would like them to respond, what an appropriate response actually looks like and what it involves, right? It involves more than just saying, yes, Sarah, I totally agree. That is a great point. I really like what you've said there, right? We want them to go a little bit more beyond that. And so one thing that I have found to be very helpful, and I know it was helpful for me as a student, was when I was able to see what an appropriate response looked like. And so to even bolster that, you can also create a rubric, if you want, that helps guide students through the points that you would like them to provide in the discussion. And so the more robust their responses are, the more you and the students in the class have to respond to, right? Sometimes that engagement can fall flat when there's just nothing to engage with or nothing to respond to. So that modeling what you would like it to look like, and you can do that, in the discussion board. You can do that through an announcement. You can do it through a video, right? There are multiple ways to do that, but providing them that kind of example can take you a long way as well. Other questions, other concerns, any stories that anybody wants to share of successes or even learning moments, teachable moments? I mean, is it so? Great question. Is it appropriate to make group competitions in class and provide small gifts for the winning teams. That is totally up to you. I have, as a student and an instructor, experienced both. Sometimes you can, award things in terms of extra credit points. I've also had, received little $5 Starbucks, gifts, which are the best kinds of gifts here and there. So you can absolutely do that. It does also drive engagement. It drives engagement amongst the team members. It really helps all of the teams participate, and it can bring the whole class into it. So that is a great strategy as well. I think really anything that you do, I would keep it at very low stakes gifts, right? Low stakes reward. Yeah, students can get offended. What you may want to do, that is possible thing that you can run into as well. I don't know that there's an actual best practice on that. I think different classes are going to lend themselves. I would keep any kind of rewards very low stakes. And you might even think about doing tiered rewards, whether it's, a $5 Starbucks or extra credit points toward an exam, or, you get to drop a quiz or something to that effect. Can be effective in terms of establishing, that everybody gets something, they just get something a little bit different. Again, I think you have to kind of understand what the dynamics of your course are. Some courses, particularly if they're smaller courses, can lend themselves to this. I have done it in a larger class where everybody receives some sort of an incentive or some sort of a reward. But again, you really have to kind of understand and be engaged with your class to see if that is an appropriate thing for your course. I hope that answers your question. Awesome. Other thoughts, other questions, other stories? These are great questions. You guys are already engaged. So that's fabulous. And just by being here, I think you're engaged. So thank you for being here. Thinking of your students, because really it is about creating the most successful opportunities for our students. And the more engaged they are in retrieving their information, digesting, course content, the more successful they're going to be in class. And really, if we go back to, the community of inquiry model, the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence, these things are always at play in our class, and we engage them at different points. And, when we think about engaging our students, and particularly in discussions, that's really about our teaching presence, and then a bit about our cognitive and social presences as well. But the key is just, I think the more engaged we are as instructors in our classes, the more contact we have with our students, the more engaged they're going to be, right? But that is always, no matter what, across the board, that is folks' number one priority and number one concern. Oftentimes is, I want to make sure my students are engaged. I want to make sure we create opportunities for engagement. And discussions, whether we love them or loathe them, they are really important to student learning, to digesting the content of the course, to interacting with the content of the course, to interacting with each other, and to interacting with you. And so they're pretty vital places to learn and interact. So again, we've got about 5 minutes left. If folks have questions, if not, you get 5 minutes back into your day as we wrap up the morning.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Oh, sorry, do we have a question?
No, we may have a little feedback.
Lindsay, did you have a question?
No, Lindsay, we cannot hear you. Oh, yes, that is Lindsay. We can't hear you, but if you want to type your question into the chat. And again, I just want to remind folks that we'll be sending out a follow-up email with this presentation and along with a, I guess you would call it a job aid document, but it's really just a document with ways to facilitate active learning. There's probably about 20 or so active learning strategies on this document that you can, take a look at and think about different ways that you might be able to employ in your class, whether you are teaching face-to-face, whether you're teaching using WebEx or hybrid, or whether you are online, right? We tried to provide just a spectrum of examples and activities that you can use. And so I think hopefully these will be helpful, and you can always reach out to us. Our contact info is here, but I will also include our contact info and some additional resources in the follow-up email. Look for that a little bit later today. Lindsay, groups. Oh, yes. Yes, so awesome. Thinking about groups. Again, groups are super effective for getting students to interact with each other, and really if you're teaching a larger class. And so, yeah, scaling down the discussions to smaller groups, it allows the instructor to engage more thoroughly and effectively. That is an awesome point. Right? Because as opposed to engaging with 50 students, you may be engaging with 10 groups. And so that can really help provide. Hey.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Before we end today's session, again, just want to thank our presenters for sharing their time and their expertise with us today, and also thank you to everyone who participated and joined today. Before you all log off, I just posted a link in the chat for a quick feedback survey. If you could take a moment and fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. And then have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Good luck, and please reach out if you have questions. Have a great afternoon.